Thank you very much for coming. It's lovely to have so many people here. Absolutely thrilled that you've all come along. And I hope you've been enjoying the exhibition. And as Anthony said, we'll be here for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll troop back over the road and have another glass of wine and hopefully have an opportunity to wander around the exhibition a little bit longer. I'm only going to speak for a few minutes. I want to start out by thanking Anthony, who's been unbelievably generous and helpful over the last few months as we've been developing this project. I want to offer a special thanks to Claire Corrin, who's the gallery's exhibition manager and has been phenomenal and unbelievably calm and competent with all of my madness in the months and weeks, and especially over the last few days. Just kind of wonderful to work with. And the rest of the team who've been up for the last 5 days solid. I think since Friday, they've been working away like crazy fiends, putting the exhibition together, and have done a fantastic job. And I'm absolutely thrilled at every brush of paint, every little bit that they've done in that time. It's been quite phenomenal. So thank you to all of them for their help. I know they're here, and hopefully they're drinking free booze as part of a larger institutional thank you. I have to reserve my greatest thanks to the artists that are involved in the show, who've been wonderful to work with and incredibly generous and really kind, not just to agree to work with me and with the gallery, but just really kind of kind in helping us think through the show and their work in the show, and to make sense of some of the really kind of complicated procedures that are involved in developing an exhibition, and making sure that their work is properly represented and kind of makes sense within the context of the show as well. So I'm very grateful for their kindness and help. And this is what happens, you know, at the end of it. You get to drink wine and chat, and that's quite a wonderful thing. The exhibition How to Construct a Time Machine, if I just spend 2 or 3 minutes kind of talking about that, really comes out of a long-term interest that I've got in time. Not just time per se, but the experience of time, which is to say, you know, how we as human beings experience time in very different kind of ways. If you think about how time drags, or time might go by in the blink of an eye, there's a strange kind of elasticity to time. We're very aware of kind of clock time, you know, how we're managed by our alarm clocks that wake us up in the morning, having breakfast, going to work at 9 o'clock, clocking on, clocking off, and so on and so forth. And the incredibly kind of powerful ways in which clock time manages and structures our days. And at the same time, we have this really kind of expansive sense of experiential time, and how our experience of being in the world isn't quite the same as how clocks seem to manage us. And so for me, one of the kind of the starting points for trying to make sense of the exhibition was how to reconcile the kind of the logic of clock time with this much more amorphous experience of time as we actually sense it kind of physically, psychologically over the course of a day or a week or a year. So that was really kind of the starting point, and also thinking about a lot of artists over the last few years who've been interested in time in different kind of ways, kind of playing around, especially with that relationship between the past, the present, and the future, and realizing that the past and the present and the future were also quite flexible. You know, the past wasn't only in the past, the future wasn't only in the future. There was a way that art seemed to allow the past to come into the present, the future to come into the present, the past, the present, and the future to not get confused, but to almost swap places with one another. And I started thinking about how art had this capacity to function like a time machine, dare one say it, you know, to transport us, to transport our thinking, to function as a device of some kind, to give us access to the past in different kinds of ways, to perhaps even give us access to the future in different kinds of ways as well. I was also really kind of fascinated by a lot of artists who were trying to kind of think about the nature of their own artworks as kind of time machines themselves. So people who were kind of playing around with different kinds of systems, you know, anything from the alphabet, if you go to the exhibition and look at Thompson and Craighead's work called the Time Machine in Alphabetical Order, where you'll see that they've kind of played around with the narrative of the 1960s science fiction movie and completely rearranged the entire film so that it takes place in alphabetical order. And you get this amazing kind of confusion and sense of estrangement that takes place under those conditions. If you look at Ruth Ewan's clock, which some of you may have seen on the outside of the building, it's Ruth Ewan. Thank you for being here. You know, it's a 10-hour clock. It's the most peculiar thing to try and get one's head around what it means to live one's life under the regime of a digital clock that's driven by a logic of 100 seconds, 100 minutes, 10 hours over a 24-hour period. It's a whole different way of trying to experience the day as it unfolds. So it was those kind of experiments that really interested me, and that's what I think, you know, each one of the works in the exhibition does in one way or another, whether it's historical or contemporary, whether it's art or non-art. And I think there's some really interesting conversations between those historical works and the more contemporary ones, between the artworks and the non-artworks, and trying to understand some of those relationships between, let's say, you know, early moving image culture, kind of, you know, pre-cinematic or cinematic moments, and how they also resonate in contemporary artists' work who are thinking about time-based media and the way that kind of time is kind of embodied in and articulated by kind of video and film work as well. So that's kind of the genesis for the show, and that's really all I want to say, other than to flag up the fact that there's a really wonderful catalogue that accompanies the exhibition. Thank you, Herman, who's here, for having done a wonderful job of designing it, and to all the team here who have turned it over in 3 days. Which is quite an amazing thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's available for sale in the shop. Yeah? Okay. It's my pleasure to welcome up here Ruth Ewan and Mark Wallinger, both of whom are in the exhibition and have kindly agreed to join us for a conversation. This evening they're going to spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about the work that they've kindly let us use for the show. Maybe a little bit about how it relates to some of either the other concerns in the exhibition or other recent work of theirs. And then we're hoping to either open it up to a conversation between ourselves or really open it up to the floor. And if anyone has any questions or comments they'd like to make about anything that's been said here or about the exhibition, about where to buy the catalogue, you should feel free to people put their hands up? Do that. So, I'm over here, Mark. I have a question, and then hopefully we can, you know, have a really nice conversation that will see us through till about 7:45, where we'll go back over the road and have another beer. Thank you for coming. Shall I hand over to Ruth? Yeah.
Yeah.
Alphabetical order.
Hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be in the show, Mark, and thanks for having me here this evening. Shall I just begin by talking a bit about the background of the clock project? So most of my work comes about through working with very specific contexts, whether that's a place, an outdoor place, or a particular type of institution. And the clock project was first commissioned for part of the Folkestone Triennial, which took place in 2011. And I did a site visit in Folkestone the first time I visited there, and one of the first things that was pointed out to me was that it's one of the only points in Britain where you can actually see France from the coastline. And it's the point from which most people, when they choose to swim the channel, they will swim from Folkestone. And it led to me wanting to realise a piece of work that I'd been wanting to realise for some time, but kind of tweak it into the location, which was to create a decimal clock which had been in use for approximately 2.5 years, just after the French Revolution in 1793 in France. It became the official time frame that was used in France and in some of the French colonies. And it was part of a much wider project called the Republican Calendar, which is a sort of secularized framework of the whole calendar year, where all religious reference points, all saints' days are stripped away, and the year is kind of rehung through this natural framework of the autumn equinox, which is New Year, on 22nd of September, and every day is then renamed after a particular item from the natural world or agriculture, and it was a way of kind of stripping away symbols of ostentation as well as very sort of what we might think of as quite mundane things in the calendar. There's a day called watering can, there's a day, today would be called butcher's broom, and we would be in the month of rain. Last month was called snow. So it was a way of reimagining things, and the decimal clock was part of that. The whole metric measuring system, very close to what we use as our metric measuring systems, were devised in that period, and they succeeded and stayed with us. Decimal time didn't, largely because clocks were so expensive to produce. It didn't translate into the sort of rural areas. There just weren't that many clocks around. You know, people told the time through bells, bells ringing. A lot of them had been melted, I think, following the French Revolution, but they were used to telling the time through bells. They were used to telling the time from the sun. So clocks were quite a rare thing, and a few timepieces in that historic period were produced, and they're very sought after things that are in horological museums in Switzerland, for example. And most of the clocks that were produced in that period featured the two time frames, so you can translate between the two. So the example of the clock that's hung outside here features decimal time and standard time. Decimal time takes the day and reorders it into 10 hours rather than 24 hours. So midday becomes 5 o'clock. Each decimal hour is a standard hour time. I think it's 2 hours 24 minutes. I might be wrong there. And within a decimal hour, there's 100 minutes, which is longer than our minute. And there's in every new minute, there's 100 seconds, which is shorter than our second. And those seconds are apparently in tune with the human pulse when walking at a very quick march. So that was a way of connecting back to the rhythm of the body and to nature again. Shall I talk about how the clocks, the sort of forms of the clocks, or shall I leave it there? So the project originally was devised as a sort of public art project where the time frame sort of slipped into Folkestone itself. The clock that's hanging here was hung on a street called Rendezvous Street, where we found an existing bracket where a shop sign had come down, and it seemed like a natural place to put the clock up. Each clock was designed to really just slip into its environment. One was a digital clock that was in the back of a taxi. One was what's called a Napoleonic clock, which is like Napoleon's hat shape, like a wooden mantle clock that sat in an antique bookshop. Another one which is still in Folkestone actually, which they kept on as part of their permanent collection, is on the Lees, quite near where you're and it's another double-sided one.
Right, cool.
Beautiful segue to Mark.
That's quite good.
Very smooth. Seamless.
Yeah, well, I suppose so Tardis is an acronym for time and relative dimensions in space, and I guess I was brought up on Doctor Who. I was saying to a couple of people that the first episode that ever went out the day that JFK was assassinated, so they had to start the new series all over again into the next new year. But anyway, that aside, there's a sort of rather anecdotal way I got to this, in that I had a year-long residency or attachment to the Natural History Museum in Oxford, which is an amazing place and kind of packs so much in the way of impact and education and everything else within quite a small building. And apart from dinosaurs and Paleolithic kind of things, it's got live colonies of cockroaches, swifts are filmed nesting in the tower, and it's also got the dodo that inspired Lewis Carroll, and each of the columns of this Victorian Gothic, which again is a bit of time travel, just those two words, all the columns are made out of different rocks native to these islands. So, I don't know, towards the end of the year, I was trying to think what I should do, and somehow the image of the Tardis presented itself, because this building, in a way, was kind of a time machine, and it pretended to be a building of an earlier period, and it was square in plan, and somehow I kind of jumped to the notion of the Tardis, which was this strange thing. I mean, the Metropolitan Police box was this strange building. It was like a conjurer's box in that it appeared to have double-sided doors that filled up each side of its structure. In fact, there was only one working door, But it was a kind of stroke of genius by the BBC creators of Doctor Who to choose this as a kind of time machine. So the first TARDISes I made were in answer to this residency, or the end of the residency, so that I had one TARDIS within the museum and one outside on the front lawn by the sequoia tree. And the notion was that you couldn't apprehend both of them at the same time, so perhaps one had teleported from outside inside, or vice versa. Bunch of students tried to make off with one outside the first night it was there. Anyway, this was during probably the longest kind of hiatus in terms of Doctor Who's televisual history. So I kind of, and then I was thinking, the thing the fascinating thing as a child was that the TARDIS was larger inside than outside, and there was a very basic video effect that happened every time it moved from one point in time and space to another, where it would slowly fade before your eyes. And so, yeah, I came up with the idea of a kind of mirrored TARDIS, which was almost like an object trying to efface itself, or it was midway between something corporeal and something unearthly, or on its way elsewhere, but that would reflect its surroundings. So in effect, it does gather all its surroundings into itself and suggests it's bigger than itself. And I think the fascination and kind of the horror for children of Doctor Who, and there seemed to be more scary programs in the 60s when I was growing up, was, I suppose, as a child, your worst fear is being lost, and you play hide and seek, and that's kind of about being lost and found in space, but the idea of being lost in time, I think, was truly terrifying, that you might wake up in a completely different reality, yeah. So that's how that came about, basically.
I didn't know that.
Sorry.
It's interesting. It's good to have these conversations. Are there any kind of immediate thoughts or questions that people have, if you'd like to kind of contribute to this conversation? You've come all this way. I mean, either about Ruth or Mark's work in particular.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
a silly one. My aunt worked for the police force. She's still got the original police station that was on Trafalgar Square.
Excellent. We'll be round her house.
And she's not going to sell it to anyone.
I bet.
As kids, we used to play in it, and she's never going to let it go.
It's been a lot of fun.
And I'm a huge Doctor Who fan.
I'd
every
sorry.
sodding thing. And I just say to her, that's not real. But no, it's been amazing to me, it's interesting. what you guys have had to say. I think everyone should give you a round of applause.
Excellent. That's there we are.
Premature.
I like that. We can go back now.
I did get to see the original blueprints for the police boxes actually. In the process of making it, I went to the Metropolitan Police Museum, which you'd think would be somewhere like Bow Street or sometime, and it was behind the home base in Charlton, and it was it was a very strange experience. They need to upgrade there, or they need more funding. The police, anyway. That's a separate point.
Give you some photos and stuff.
Yeah.
There we go. I must admit, I mean, one of the things that kind of worried me while I was putting the exhibition together was making sure that space travel didn't usurp time travel. And there are 2 or 3 works in the show that are a little bit more about space travel than they are time travel. And I kept trying to rationalise it and justify it. And I was chatting to my friend Fiona over the weekend, who said, "It sounds a bit like time travel." I was like, okay, that's fine. It sounds a bit like space travel. I was like, yeah, I know. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. And sometimes they just kind of overlap.
The Tardis also travelled in time as well as space.
I was okay with the TARDIS, but there are a few
Space-time
things
is
in there that
Planck's version
Yeah.
of relativity, so
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's,
it's-
I think
these-
they
sometimes they
elide.
do butt up against one another.
Yeah.
It's true, but just kind of,
Listening to your explanations, it's clear that to conceptualise the art and to conceptualise the curation required a shift to a different kind of logic. Once you'd inhabited that different logic, did it influence any other works that you did, or indeed the rest of your life?
I think when I was working with the decimal time, when I was really immersed with it back in 2011, I was able to fully read it in the way that I would read our time. Like, I understood it, and because even now, because I haven't looked at one of those clocks for quite a long time, so when I saw it tonight installed, it did that weird thing of like, whoa, it's 10 o'clock, it's not 10 o'clock, and it looks strange. But back in 2011, it wasn't looking strange to me anymore, and I was completely immersed in the logic of decimal time. And now, as a framework, I do believe that it is the system that we should be living by. And people laugh at me when I say that, but it's, anyone who works in kind of science, or particularly anyone who works with any sort of time-based medium where you're editing something like that, it's completely logical that we divide things by tens and hundreds. It's not logical that we divide by 6 and 12. Like, that goes back to Babylonians like 5,000 years ago, who devised, for some reason their mathematical preference was to work in 6 and 12. So it is a sort of oddity to me that there's a 24-hour clock when nothing else in our lives is divided by 24. And it's the same with another project that I'm working on at the moment that's connected to the decimal clock, which I mentioned is the Republican calendar, which was used. At the moment, I'm working on a project where every day from the Republican calendar is represented through the item in a room, so it's like a navigable calendar. This installation in the gallery becomes a navigable calendar of the year, and it completely makes sense to me that there's a month in the summertime that's called flower. That's not called August. It's so you do start to believe in these things that you're kind of acting out. You have to, otherwise you wouldn't do it.
Yeah, I think for me the idea of the logic of systems, became more and more apparent. So I started out thinking, oh, there's a clock. Clocks are kind of nice, and then gradually, slowly, clocks became really quite tyrannical. They became these objects that were dictating the way that my time was being spent. And that they were allowing me to spend time or waste time in particular kind of ways. And when you start expanding the logic of those systems, you're including clocks and then calendars and then the alphabet, and suddenly, you start noticing all of these logics that are in place that are kind of handy ways of dividing things up or making sense of things, but they're no more logical than any other system that one might have come up with. And that kind of feeling of estrangement was really interesting for me, that kind of constant estrangement from the logic of these systems. So when you look at the clock outside, and you're like, it's 10. What am I meant to do with a clock that has 10, not 12? And you kind of look at it like it's familiar enough to be able to make sense of, but it's really foreign, and the kind of the mismatch that happens between your sense of the logic of these systems, of how they should work, versus how they might work differently, was really interesting for me. Kind of curatorially, what I was really looking for was different ways of artists exploring the limits of those systems and kind of what those systems had the capacity to do in different kinds of ways. So kind of playing around with the facts or the science, or if you look at kind of Martin John Callanan's work, where he's playing around with airport departure. It's in the foyer to the right. It's a departure board, which has every plane leaving every international airport in real time, and you get a completely different sense of the logic of the system of flight, when it's presented to you on that kind of a time-based departure board model. So that kind of that messing around with systems was something that I was looking for, and excited me and kind of scared me a little bit as well.
Just wonder how leap years happen.
In the Republican calendar, so a month is 30 days long, and the working week is 10 days long, which is one of the reasons it failed, actually. I'm not joking. People complained about it. So the day of rest was on the 10th day, and you got half day on the 5th day. So actually, the clock was used for 2.5 years. The Republican calendar was used for 12, nearly 13 years, but the observance of the new week was shorter. It was only like 10 years, and they phased out the weeks because people weren't abiding by it. But leap years, so the months are kind of mathematically pure at the number 30, and then there's 5 additional days, which are called the Sanklotides, which are at the end of the year, so September, like mid-September time. And they were named after ideas rather than things. So one of them is virtue, one is talent, and in a leap year there's an additional holiday which is called revolution. So yeah, that's how they handled the leap year.
Good answer.
But they argued about it a heck of a lot.
Who was involved in the naming? Because they're very poetic, some of them are quite attached to the revolution in other ways. But was it the commissions that named them? Was there a group of people that did it?
It was all done by group. And so it was a collaboration. The artist David was involved. And it was Gilbert Rom. Was one of the devisers of the calendar, and then there was another poet who collaborated with a horticulturalist to figure out what was in season at particular moments, but then also to use a particular word for that thing. So it was, say, like so many different names for different plants. It was very, very carefully controlled, and the names of the months were not in French. The day names were in French, but the names of the months were new words which were created, which were a fusion of French, Latin, and Greek.
There was a hand up, there we go. 2 hands.
Sorry. Do the names of the months in the calendar change geographically?
Changed geographically. What?
Yeah, so depending on where you live in the world, do they change? Because you refer to one being called flower.
Well, this was the problem with it, was that it was a very centric project, and it would mean that if you've got one thing in season in France, you don't necessarily have it in season in the French colonies. So that was one of the reasons that they decided to abandon it as well.
Mm-hmm. And this is presumably the beginning of the process of the standardization of time across Europe as well. So they're kind of looking for ways of trying to make sure that a train that leaves Lyon at 3 o'clock
Yeah.
arrives in Paris at 9 o'clock, and one person's version of 3 o'clock is the same as another person's version at 9 o'clock.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
so-
yeah. And for markets, I think, were the main reason to sync everything up, and that caused the most massive confusion and brawls and things like that erupted when markets were misaligned and people lost their business. So it was, in the end, Napoleon scrapped it.
Yeah.
I just wondered, firstly, what was the starting point in terms of work from the show for you when you were curating it, and also, obviously, with Mark's aside, which is your favourite work?
I guess the starting point was the aftermath of Christian Marquard's Clock, the work that was kind of shown a lot 3 or 4 years ago. It's kind of a 24-hour edit of every film that has ever included a clock to fill 24 hours. And I was really interested in the kind of the editing. I didn't like the work very much, but I really liked the editing. And it was around the same time that I was thinking about editing that I saw Ali and John's work, the Thompson and Craighead piece, which is in the show. And it was the relationship between those two works that started this. And I didn't think the Markley was very interesting, but I thought editing was. And so I just started thinking about the different ways in which editing is used as a productive process, and what happens when you make those kinds of decisions to kind of cut things and then arrange them and put them back together in different kinds of ways. And what happens, for instance, in Ali and John's work when you alphabeticize a narrative. It does incredible things to how you understand the work and engage with it, and it changes it completely. So it's not just an exercise in montaging, which is what I thought the Markley was, without being too mean. He's not here. So that was the beginning, and I mean you'll see kind of it's unacknowledged in most of the exhibition, but a lot of the work is thinking about the different ways that editing is capable of changing time. From the Lumiere brothers' work, which has one kind of reverse edit where time goes backwards for the first time in 1895 in a moving image. And you're like, okay, that's a particular kind of shift out of the logic of narrative to something that goes backwards, that folds back on itself, that completely undoes how we understand narrative as working from the past into the future. It changes everything, and it comes back kind of again and again in different kinds of ways. So either editing being part of the content of the work, or editing kind of built into the machinery of the work. So I mean, there's work. I think Catherine Yaz is somewhere here, and Edgar and Ellen are here as well, both of whom have work in the show, projection work, where again the kind of the mechanisms of the work kind of exploring and exposing the way the film, but also the mechanism of projection itself, kind of weaves isn't quite right, but intervenes into the process of making the work meaningful in certain kind of ways. Editing. Ali and John's work. Hi.
I was going to ask Richie's question.
Oh, good.
Basically, going back to calendars, I'm sorry. I travel quite a lot, and a lot of European countries still go by the Georgian calendar. How do you find that?
How do I find different calendars?
Because a lot of people go by the Georgian calendar in Europe,
What do you mean by the Georgian calendar?
rather than the calendar we know in this country.
Yeah.
Does it affect your research?
Well, I'm quite up close focused on the Republican calendar and our own calendar. I haven't really worked outside of those calendars.
Okay. I just wanted to ask.
No, this is just kind of a comment on what you said about making time more uniform and spreading uniform time across Europe, and also something else one of you said about this is all arbitrary. I mean, some interesting things in that, I think. If you go to the services in Oxford Cathedral, for instance, they don't start at Greenwich Mean Time. They start, I think it's 5 or 7 minutes past. And that's a kind of strange time because that's the mean solar time there, but it doesn't mean that it's the exact solar time. It does vary from one time of the year to the other. So, you know, when they start doesn't match the times on the clocks in Oxford, it's kind of different. And, you know, there's some ways in which we're so linked to time in that, which we wouldn't have been going back centuries, which is why they had to introduce summertime to make us work different hours. We couldn't possibly all start at 8 o'clock instead of 9 o'clock or vice versa. They had to change the clock. And you kind of think, in what ways are we tied to this and what ways we aren't? And that's why I think showing the 10-hour clock makes that really, really interesting, rather.
Well, I mean, I think there's an interesting thing to show between the kind of phenomenological experience of time and a kind of historical sense of time. And so there's a lot of work in the show that's kind of riffing on work that is known to be from a certain era, so that itself cites itself. So that's kind of, it's sort of fair game, but it carries with it a lot of baggage of that time, you know. And I suppose I've been knocking around long enough that I do remember, you know, William Hartnell was my first Doctor Who, and I think just taking my piece for example, you know, I suppose for me, I still have the memory of the police boxes in London as they existed, and that was a very clever trick that the BBC did. I mean, no one of subsequent generations really knows that, or it's become just a moment of reference, you know. So now it's just like something off the telly. So I would imagine, you know, my piece, at least for following generations, suddenly conjures up, oh, that was the scale of it. And so it has some of that kind of charisma, or that kind of sense of I recognise you from the telly, you know. And so it's got something of that, and it's got something of, it's got some intent about it, because it doesn't want to exactly be there and be stable for you. But I think it's, but I think we're actually unbelievably acutely aware of how things are figured through time. I mean, or, you know, if we want a witness on the news, then it's got to be pretty much digital, and you know, long gone are the times when, you know, sitcoms used to have scenes outside that were shot on film, but we can kind of date that, and we have this kind of, I think, acute ability of actually dating all these different modes of representation as well, you know. So I think that's, you know, we kind of chew up time in lots of different ways like that. And I think this show's really very good about how all those things, you know, just quite what we get from there. You know, we appreciate the playfulness of early cinema and that sense of possibility that was there, and we sometimes we get in this sophisticated kind of melange, and it's a kind of tonic to kind of be brought back to first principles about, you know, what frame by frame, what that is about. Yeah,
it's meant to be fun, you know. I mean, it's meant to be slightly absurdist as well. You know, the title of the exhibition comes from a text that Alfred Jarry wrote in response to the publication of H.G. Wells's book in France in the late 19th century. So Jarry wrote a text called How to Construct a Time Machine, which pretended to be a scientific text, and it was actually kind of heralded as, you know, scientifically verifiable account of time travel. But it was completely made up. He was kind of, you know, using a whole load of different kind of scientific discourses and physics, and, you know, pretending that he'd magicked this kind of, you know, legitimate, scientifically verifiable version of time travel. I think there's something really nice about the absurdist, or that kind of, I'd be nicer and call it magical kind of quality of a lot of the work as well. There are different kinds of magic, I think, going on. Some of it's the ridiculousness of things, and then some of it has maybe more to do with, I don't know, kind of cosmic time. There's you know, going back to this thing about,
but I think that's
travel,
the nice thing,
you know,
because you was talking early on, you know, like time is our master, you know, and we feel oppressed by that. So The
How do you
very
get away-
idea you
how
can
do you get
start
away
playing,
from that?
yeah.
And
The idea you
magic
can play
is
with
one of
that,
the ways
yeah.
of doing that. You know, there's a work in there, I don't know if you saw in the far gallery, a brass ball on the floor, which is a time bomb, you know, which is due to explode in 2104. You know, and it will explode, you know, it absolutely will. There's a meteorite, you know, on the floor in one of the middle galleries, which is a real meteorite, you know, which has been traveling in time and space for 4.5 billion years, you know, from before the beginning of human existence. You know, there's something quite magical about that. I mean, something also quite magical about the fact that it isn't a real meteorite. It's a meteorite that's been turned into a work of art, you know, through various kinds of sleights of hand. So I think there's you know, an effort to kind of stretch beyond the limitations of those strictures as well. Yeah, no, very much so. Hello.
I'm really interested to know, with your 10-hour clock, when you were working up so closely with it, did it affect your daily way of living? Did you kind of feel like you were stepping outside the normal mode of living that people were following?
Yeah, I wouldn't say my normal mode of living, but it was like the translation between the two came very easy. Like if you learn to speak another language well, it was just like second nature. But I feel like I've kind of forgotten decimal time a little bit because I haven't looked at it properly. But yeah, 5 o'clock as midday really felt like that was the way I started to do it, and then would work from either side of that. And yeah.
So was your day structured differently?
I wouldn't say it was, because I actually don't. Well, I actually don't like clocks that much, like standard clocks, and I don't have any clocks in my house. I don't wear a watch. I only look at my clock like if I have to go to a meeting, I have to be somewhere. I try to avoid like what you referred to, like the sort of the tyranny of standard time, and it reminded me of something that someone told me years and years ago. I went on a walking tour around Clerkenwell, and the person doing that told me that when Lenin lived in Clerkenwell, he lived very near Hatton Garden, which is the sort of jewellery district of London, and it's where all the clockmakers were. And he described them as a network of tyranny. And he had a real problem with this standard time as well. So I wouldn't go quite that far that it's a network of tyranny, but I do, like I say, I kind of believe in decimal time more than the standard time.
I went to buy a digital clock just recently because I needed well, for various reasons, but anyway, an alarm and a thing that could play the radio and then go into sleep mode and not wake me up again and all that kind of thing. And the guy brought me this one that was exactly like the one in Groundhog Day, and I just thought, no, I can't. 6 o'clock every morning, Sonny and Cher. I can't hack that. No.
That's tyranny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any more pressing questions?
Yeah.
I'll stand up because I'm short. You know, it's annoying me because I'm an engineer. I'm not a great fan of nature.
Cards on the table.
I'm a bit of a fan of the French Revolution. I like the idea of a decimal clock. When I did engineering, converting from SI units to pounds, feet, whatever. The thing that's made me think is when you mention film, because I think it's mentioned that there's not many things that are divided by 12 or 24, but the frame rate on film is about 24. So I'm just thinking nature's beat me again.
That's really
that
interesting.
is the thing that's maybe worth exploring a bit more, because I'm just wondering if there is some natural thing that makes the 12 or 24-hour clock makes us more relaxed or just in tune with nature, which I'm generally not in. Anyway, it's just a thought when you're connecting the film thing to the and that thing's flashing, I'm sure it's about 24 frames a second as well. Anyway,
that's a really good one. Yeah.
Yeah, but if it was revolutionary seconds, they're shorter, so it might be 20, I don't know.
roughly.
I was just going to say to our engineer friend, it's a mathematician's equivalent for the Dewey Decimal, because 12 is dividable equally, whereas 10 isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on that happy note, I think we can bring these conversations back over the road. Please come over the road, have another glass of wine, have another look around the exhibition, buy a catalogue. Please join me in thanking Ruth and Mark for being so kind and generous in agreeing to join us for this conversation.